Welcome to Kalimahorra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, the fastest growing television service in the Arab-speaking world. Tonight we're discussing the Ukraine, Russia, and its collapsing relationship with Western powers, especially the United States of America, but also some of its key allies, including this one, the United Kingdom. Now, the first point I want to make clear is that the West has been mad at Russia for a very long time. You could say right back to 1917, when the Russian Revolution occurred and the Western allies landed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, not often remembered, in the territory that became the Soviet Union in order to try and reverse the Russian Revolution. Then it became obvious that the Russian Revolution wasn't going anywhere, and so they transformed hot war against the Russians to Cold War. And that Cold War lasted a long time. They got even more mad at the Russians when it was they who conquered Berlin in 1945. They got really mad when the Russians developed a nuclear bomb, ending the monopoly on nuclear weapons held by the United States. Ultimately, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the West began to love Russia for the first time in almost 100 years. They loved it because it was ruled by a drunken fool called Boris Yeltsin, who allowed Russia's national wealth to be privatized and stolen by a whole plethora of plutocrats of the former Soviet Union's nomenclatura, as well as others. Much of Russia's national wealth went abroad, and some of it, quite a lot of it, actually here to London. But the drunker Yeltsin got, the more stupid he got, the more he allowed Russia's wealth to be stolen, the more they loved him. And when he was replaced by President Vladimir Putin, the West got mad at Russia all over again. Because Putin is many things, but the one thing he's not is a pushover. His name's Putin, not pushover. And he has stood up to not just the West, but the oligarchs within Russia itself, many of whom are now in prison. And one of the main political missions of President Putin is to return Russia's wealth back to Russia. So far, so good, as far at least as I am concerned. That's what the Russian people deserve. After all their sacrifice in the Second World War, when they lost 26 million people in that war, it's the least that they deserve, that their national wealth should be their own preserve. I'm making these points because I don't want you to think that this crisis is about Ukraine. It started long before Ukraine. In fact, you can say that it began to peak far from the Russian area itself in relation to the Arab Republic of Syria. You see, the United States and the United Kingdom and France, the former colonial powers, wanted to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and Russia said no. And Russia made clear in the United Nations, where it has veto power, that they would never allow a repeat of the Libyan fiasco, where a resolution was taken from the United Nations, misused, turned into the opposite of what it said it was, and used to overthrow the regime in Libya with the catastrophic results that everyone has seen. So they began to get even more mad against Putin, even more mad against Russia because of Syria. And by extension, because Russia refuses to go along with the policy of sanction, quarantine, and double standards against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Then came the Ukraine. What happened in Ukraine is widely misunderstood amongst the Western public and deliberately misunderstood by Western politicians and media. They say that Russia has invaded Ukraine. The truth is that NATO invaded Ukraine, and everything that Russia has done since is a response to NATO's intervention in Ukraine. What do I mean by intervention? Ukraine had an elected president and an elected parliament. I didn't care for either of them. They're not my choice. They're nothing to do with me. But they were chosen democratically in an election by the people of the Ukraine. And moreover, another election was due in less than a year. But the Western powers, principally the United States, principally Victoria Nuland, who's now at the State Department but was then the US ambassador to Ukraine, by her own admission, pumped millions and millions of dollars into the protest that became known as the Mayadeen, which ultimately overthrew the elected president by force, invaded the Ukrainian parliament by force, set it on fire, and held guns literally to the heads of the members of parliament until they agreed to support the dissolution of the parliament, the overthrow of the president. And the first act of this revolutionary new parliament was to outlaw the teaching and speaking of the Russian language in the Ukraine. Now, 45% of the people of Ukraine are Russian speakers. It is a bilingual country. And suddenly, Russian was equated with some kind of terrorist language, and the language banned from all official discourse. The people in the east and the south of Ukraine completely rejected the coup which took place in Kiev. A fascist, right-wing, ultra-Ukrainian nationalist takeover of power was always going to be rejected by the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine. And so they said, well, if Ukraine wants to be led by such people, we don't want to be in Ukraine. We want to rejoin Russia, which of course, in the past, historically, they had been a part of. In Crimea, where the Russian Republic had a treaty in what was called the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, the clue being in the words Autonomous Republic, the people of the Autonomous Republic said, we want to be back with Russia, where we historically always have been. Given that the Russian naval base there was critical to Russia's whole defense posture, Russia supported the decision of the people of Crimea to rejoin their country. And now, in the east and the south of Ukraine, there is full-scale war. It is a war that was chosen by the coup regime in Kiev. It is a defensive war that is being fought by the people of East and South Ukraine. Russia has not invaded Ukraine. If Russia invaded Ukraine, the war would have been over in an afternoon. Because anybody that thinks Russia can be played with militarily doesn't know the facts of life. If Russia wanted to, it could end this war this evening by moving its forces to defend the Russian-speaking people of eastern Ukraine. But it has not done so. Of course, there are Russians helping fellow Russians inside eastern Ukraine, but that's not the Russian state policy. Diplomacy has been the stance of the Russian government from the start. Putin, his foreign minister, all his ambassadors and plenipotentiaries around the world have been trying to find a diplomatic solution to this crisis in a way that would not lead to war. But the West is bent on encroaching on Russia. NATO has constantly advanced closer and closer to the Russian frontier. Well, you don't know the facts of life if you think Russia is going to allow a hostile military alliance to have bases and missiles all around it pointing at it. The Russians reject this, and so they should, and so they must. Sanctions have been imposed upon Russia, just like the ones on Iran, getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And now we have the absurdity in Britain where the language that's being used in the media and in Parliament is like the Cold War, as if Russia were still some kind of communist enemy of Western powers, when it is not. And it's getting dangerous. Just in the last few days, Russian military aircraft flying in international airspace, this is important, flying in international airspace, were buzzed by British Air Force jets and threatened, and the Russian ambassador has been called into the Foreign Office to be given a lecture by the jumped-up Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom, whose name nobody in Britain even knows, wagging his finger at the Russians for daring to fly in international airspace. This from people who are invading other people's countries all over the world, sending their army, navy, air force to bomb and shell and occupy other people's countries all around the world, lecturing Russia about flying in international airspace. That's the backdrop. I've got an audience of gifted professionals and enthusiastic amateurs like me, and the discussion starts after this.